Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 203 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. There are some stories that we know inside and out to the point at which we don't tend to think about the details anymore. One of these stories is the biblical fall of man, the one which leads to Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. If someone asked you on trivia night what fruit it was that Eve picked, chances are you'd reflexively say an apple, and you'd get the point. But not everyone in the Middle Ages would have chosen the same answer. This week, I spoke with Dr. Azzan Yadin-Israel about the forbidden fruit and its transformation over time. Azzan is a professor of Jewish studies and classics at Rutgers University and the author of books and articles on rabbinic thought, such as Scripture and Tradition, Rabbi Akiva and the Triumph of Midrash, as well as The Grace of God and the Grace of Man, the theologies of Bruce Springsteen. His new book is Temptation Transformed, the story of how the forbidden fruit became an apple. Our conversation on what the original fruit of original sin was, how written culture and art worked together to transform it, and why it took centuries to settle on the apple is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Azzan, for coming and talking to me about the forbidden fruit. It's such a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is a very specific argument, and I have to ask you, what got you interested in this? Because I think most people just generally think, oh, it's an apple. What got you interested?
Well, to some extent, that's exactly what got me interested. In other words, that I think that it's worthwhile if scholarship can uncover things that we don't even know are an issue. In other words, because we assume we know them, we don't really spend much time thinking about it. And there is something valuable about that to say, not only because of the specific point, but it also kind of lays bare a broader point, which is there are a lot of issues that we need to rethink, even though we're not necessarily aware of them. More specifically regarding the apple, it really is based on a mistranslation of mine. When I was a young assistant professor, I always made a point of reading Greek and Latin with graduate students. I myself, most of my work was in Semitic languages, either in Hebrew or in Aramaic, and this was a way to keep up my Greek and Latin. And I was reading a passage from Augustine from the Confessions with a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, Aaron Puchigin, who's gone on to be a translator from Greek and from other languages as well. And the passage is one in which young Augustine, he's not yet saint, but he's just young Augustine, is pelting this poor sow that's standing out in the field. He and his friends are pelting her with poma, which, is just a plural Latin form. And I didn't prepare these translations. We would just sit together and read. And largely because of French, because of pomme in French, which means apple, I said they were throwing apples at this sow. And Aaron stopped and said, no. It's true that later that word does come to mean apple in some Romance languages, but it's just a generic term for fruit. And at the moment that he said that, I thought to myself, I wonder if the mistake that I just made is somehow tied to the broader shift from fruit generically to apple specifically. At the time, I did not pursue this idea. I had to, get my tenure book out, and then I wrote a second book. These are all books on rabbinic biblical interpretation. But it stayed with me. And at a certain point, I came back to it and started digging and ultimately resulted in the book that we're talking about right now.
It's one of these mysteries, I think, as you say, it's important to pull apart because it's just accepted. And maybe we should question these accepted truths. And I love how you came across this as just an automatic translation error in some ways. Okay, so for the people who are not familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, I don't think there's a lot, but can you tell us the story of Adam and Eve so that we're all on the same page before we begin this?
Sure. The story that I'm referring to, also called the Fall of Man narrative, basically it occurs in Genesis in chapter 3 mostly, and Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and God prohibits the consumption of the fruit of two trees. There's a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil. All the other trees are permitted. Spoiler alert, despite the explicit prohibition, Adam and Eve do end up consuming the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of knowledge. Eve is tempted to do so by a talking serpent. And as a result, Adam and Eve, and that is to say all of humanity that is to come, are expelled from the Garden of Eden, no longer live in that blessed state as the Bible would describe it. And the rest is history.
The rest is unfortunate history for humankind.
The rest is human history, yes.
Okay, and for the people who aren't biblical scholars here, when we're talking about translation, it's probably worthwhile thinking about originally, what language would this have been written in? And when it comes to the Middle Ages, what language are we at?
Right. So the Bible is in Hebrew, is in ancient Hebrew. And in the text of Genesis 3, the Hebrew word that is used is just the word for fruit. It never specifies, the biblical text never specifies the kind of fruit that is the cause of this transgression. Of course, in the Middle Ages, at this point, we're talking about a Latin translation. We're talking about the Vulgate that basically becomes, capital T, the Bible. As far as Christian Europe is concerned, Jerome's translation, the Vulgate, is the Bible. And here, the same thing occurs. In other words, you again have the Latin word fructus, which is just a generic term for fruit. So the Latin text does not change or alter the biblical Hebrew. It quite faithfully renders the word as fruit.
Right. And just one more clarifying thing. When Jerome is translating the Vulgate, is he translating it from Hebrew or is he translating it from Greek?
No, he's actually translating it from Hebrew. Jerome worked with Jewish colleagues and he learned Hebrew. There are a number of early Christian scholars who learned Hebrew, and he works directly with the Hebrew and he uses the Hebrew text as his basis.
Okay, great. So now we've established we are as close as we can get to the original Hebrew when Jerome is translating it, and then the Vulgate is passed around. In the Middle Ages, as you say, it is the Bible that pretty much everyone is using. So
Right.
We know that it's fructus in Latin. And when you started looking into this, you found all sorts of different fruits. So who are the front runners for the evil fruit of the Garden of Eden?
Right. So, there are two different tracks here that we could go on. The historical and empirical track, which is the one, Danièle, you just referred to, is, as you say, full of different candidates. There is an early tradition that identifies the forbidden fruit as a fig, and that is grounded in the biblical narrative itself because Adam and Eve consumed the forbidden fruit. As soon as they do so, it says their eyes open and they realize that they're naked, and they immediately cover themselves with fig leaves. That's the famous picture we have of Adam and Eve with fig leaves. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the forbidden fruit was a fig, but at least the scholars and the interpreters have something to go on there, right? They're saying they consumed the fruit and they immediately realized they were naked and covered themselves with fig leaves. Maybe they were standing by a fig tree. At least there's something. Another tradition, a very ancient tradition, has the forbidden fruit as grapes. And that has to do with the connection between alcohol and transgression, one that is apparently still alive and well, to this day. And also there are priestly prohibitions against consuming alcohol. For example, priests aren't allowed to enter into the sanctuary drunk. So, there are a number of cultural, but also textual hints that this might be the forbidden fruit. And then there are also citrons appear, pomegranates. They're really a very interesting array of historic candidates. The other track that I mentioned is the way that this has all been interpreted. And that is basically, as you said, the evil fruit. There has been this tendency among scholars to assume that the apple has either always or going back to antiquity been the forbidden fruit. And that particular tradition is explained as the result of a Latin play on words, which is that the Latin word for apple, malum, is also the Latin word for an evil thing or evil. so that this is the claim at least, that there is a theological argument here that if the forbidden fruit brought about the fall of man, the expulsion from Eden, such a terrible malum, evil, in theological terms, what better fruit than the malum, the apple? That's a very, very common and widely held view. You find it, in literature and scholarly literature all the time. It's groundless. I don't know how to say this in a more subtle or respectful way, but, there really is, as far as I could find, no real basis for it. In fact, what there is this much richer and kind of more varied tradition of the fig, the grape, the pomegranate, and the apple only appears much later.
Yeah, a couple of the examples that you found were mangoes and bananas, which were just mind-blowing to me because I never saw a banana in Sunday school, in the illustrations.
No.
Adam and Eve.
The apple reigns triumphant today. And yes, absolutely. There's a beautiful image that I include in the book of Adam holding a mango. And not coincidentally, it's a picture that was drawn in Paris in the very late 15th century. And not coincidentally, that's exactly the time when Portuguese sailors began importing mangoes from India into Europe. So you see this wonderful moment where the commercial ties, the emerging commercial ties with India and the sudden availability of mangoes in Europe were taken by this one artist as maybe this was the forbidden fruit, It's sweet, it's delicious, it's kind of exotic. Maybe that's where Eden is. And in fact, that's how he represents Adam and Eve.
Yeah, exactly. It's coming from this place that's mysterious. It's on the edge of the map. In a lot of maps, it could be the place where Eden was. So this is a good candidate for it.
Yes,
as well.
Exactly.
But you're right. You never see that now. One of the tracks that you followed in your investigation was actually leading towards Hercules, which I thought was an interesting connection that you found in illustrations of Adam and Eve. Can you tell us for a second about where you found that?
Sure. There is an interesting, I don't know what's called parallel, but analog, something like that in Greek mythology, where one of the tasks that Hercules has to perform is he has to steal the fruit of the tree of the Hesperides. And that tree is protected by either a dragon or a serpent, depending on the tradition and depending on how you interpret that Greek word, it could be either a dragon or a serpent. So there actually is a rich pagan classical iconographic tradition of Hercules standing by a tree that has a serpent on it and getting the fruit, which is remarkably similar to some of the artistic renderings of the Adam and Eve picking the forbidden fruit and so forth. The reason that comes into play is because there's one case, there's one very interesting image in a sarcophagus that today is found in Spain where you see Adam reaching for an apple. That's the first instance of an apple that I could find. And after that, there's nothing. There are no apples after that. It's like this singular, for hundreds of years, there are no apples after that. And I had to figure out what was going on. Why do you have this apple? And then it's singular. It just drops off the map. And that research led me to the classical pagan iconographic tradition because Christian sarcophagi, the Christian burial sarcophagi that were produced, it's found in Spain today, but it was crafted in Rome. Apparently, the workshops that made these were working for pagan and Christian clients. In other words, if you were a wealthy Roman, whether you were pagan or Christian, you would go and hire someone and say, can you please make me a sarcophagus with these images on them? And they would make the images in the same way. In other words, if it was Hercules and the tree of the Hesperides, they had the serpent, the tree, the fruit, and Hercules picking it. If it was Genesis, they had Adam, the tree, the fruit, the serpent, and Eve would be there too. But they were the same artists making the same images. And then the apple that is found in the Hercules tradition kind of made its way into this Christian sarcophagus that is now in Saragossa.
I love that story. I love it's just the practicalities of the artists who are making this. They have one pattern. They're like, we're just going to make it. We'll paint it differently and we'll call it Adam and Eve.
That's right. No, and that's what they're that's their training. And you got to think of them trying to maximize their work. And,
Yeah.
they're just getting the work done and sending it out to the client. And it's kind of like how all of these images that now, 1600 years later, we think of them in these religious terms. And that's all true, but it was also at the time just being produced by daily workers, real life people. And that's part of what comes through.
Yes. Yeah. And that's going to be important to the end of the story, but we're not going to get to the end of the story yet. I want to take you
Okay.
on another sidetrack, which
Wonderful.
is that the apple is not always bad in the Bible or in biblical traditions or in scholarly traditions. The apple sometimes represents Jesus, represents good, right? Can you talk us through that
Yeah,
tradition?
absolutely. So this was one of the issues that I encountered when I was grappling with the explanation that I mentioned earlier about why the forbidden fruit became the apple. In other words, this Latin play on words, malum evil and malum apple. So in working through this, I first started to look at Latin commentaries because that was kind of the natural site where if someone was going to make this play on words, you would find it in the Latin commentaries. And basically, it doesn't exist. Moreover, there are, in fact, traditions that identify the apple as a symbol for Jesus rather than the forbidden fruit. And that is particularly tied to the Song of Songs. So the Song of Songs is one of the books in the Hebrew Bible, and it's a love song. Sometimes, if you read it in a straightforward manner, it's highly erotic.
Hmm.
And basically, there's a male and female lover, and they have encounters and they talk to each other and they speak about each other. And one of the things that the woman says about the man when describing his beauty, she says, he is like and I will just say apple for our purposes. He is like an apple among the trees of the forest. In other words, like his beauty is such that he is similar to an apple relative to other trees. Now I'm going to say in parentheses that the biblical Hebrew word may not actually mean apple, but it doesn't matter. That's how the Vulgate translates it. And as we said, that is the Bible of the Middle Ages. So what does that mean? Once you read this story, not in a literal way, but as an allegory, then the male figure is Jesus. And the female figure, the male lover and the female lover are Jesus and the church. That's the standard medieval understanding of the Song of Songs, the standard Christian medieval understanding of the Song of Songs. Well, if that's the case, then the church is saying about Jesus, he is like an apple among the trees of the forest. Sikut malum. In that case, Jesus is being likened to an apple. And there is a tradition that emerges from that. This occurs in Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 3. There is a tradition that arises around this verse that says Jesus is likened to an apple, and then the apple tree is the cross. So like Jesus on the cross is like the apple on the tree, on and on. You know how medieval commentators can take this theme and run with it.
Yes.
And then there's a tradition that the cross was made of an apple tree. I mean, it's just the whole thing takes on a life of its own.
Hmm.
But for our purposes, in terms of if you're looking for the source of how did the forbidden fruit become an apple, this is a hugely problematic passage for the dominant explanation, because not only do you not find interpretations that say apple equals evil, we actually have traditions that say the apple is Christ, not the sin, but the redemption.
Hmm.
So that's the context in which that comes through, where you do find traditions that talk about the apple in a very positive way.
It's funny. In the Middle Ages, as you say, just about anything can be Jesus. And so it doesn't surprise me that this fruit that is one that is enjoyed by lots of people also becomes a symbol. But as you say, you can't make the same argument that they don't understand the word well enough to be working with it. They're obviously working with it in a way that can mean all sorts of things.
Absolutely. And the important thing here is that they only understand the word in the context of the Song of Songs as meaning a fruit.
Mhm.
In other words, they're not doing anything with this ambiguity in the Latin. They just think malum is an apple. The male is likened to an apple. Therefore, Jesus is likened to an apple. And that's it. They don't ever say, well, it also means evil or anything like that. They just take it on kind of the botanical level.
I like that, the botanical level. All right. So, at what point do you see a marked shift between a fruit that could be any type of fruit, a fig
Right.
or grapes? When does it start to shift to being an apple at a point at which you're like, this is the tipping point?
Yeah.
This is when it takes over.
It's interesting because I have emphasized up until now the problems that I was having with the texts in the sense that they weren't yielding an answer to how it became an apple, only showing that the existing answer wasn't really working. So in order to try and answer the question you just posed, I had to shift gears methodologically. And rather than focus on the texts, I began to look at the history of the artistic representation of the forbidden fruit, in other words, of the fall of man scenes. And I was just trying to answer the question for myself for this study that I was now engaged in. When do we find apples? When do they appear? And the short answer is not until the 12th century and in France. So prior to that, you have the same kind of rich variety that I mentioned earlier with the textual evidence. You have forbidden fruit that are figs and grapes and pomegranates and citrons and wheat occasionally and, things like that. And a mango, right?
Let's not forget.
Let's not forget the mango. That's in 12th century France. Suddenly the apple appears in art. And not only does it appear, it immediately conquers the scene, which is a really interesting shift because up until now, we've had various candidates and no one seemed troubled by that. It wasn't like any one of them had to negate the others. With the apple, they all disappear. The apple basically becomes the dominant and maybe even exclusive fruit, almost, shortly after its appearance, which is a really interesting shift. And it leaves us with two questions. One, why did it appear? And two, why did it marginalize all these other candidates that we have to remember had 500, 600, 800 years of tradition behind them? These are very well-established motifs. The other thing that happens is that the apple begins to spread, the iconography of the apple. Suddenly, it appears in England. It appears in Germany. It appears in Holland. And a similar dynamic occurs. It begins to spread very quickly and to marginalize the other candidates. It does not spread to Italy. In Italy, they keep on with the fig tradition, pretty much oblivious to the apple for hundreds of years. You don't really find a sustained apple tradition in Italy until the 16th century. So now we have a third question, which is, well, A was why did the apple appear when it did? B, why did it marginalize all the other candidates, the other fruit? And now C, why did it spread the way it did? Why was it so readily accepted in Germany and England and the Low Countries, but not in Italy and not also in Spain? So the answer to your question is it appears in France in the 12th century. We still have to say why and what happened.
This is our moment. Tell us why and what happened.
All right. So a lot of people intuitively wonder if this has to do with agricultural changes, which is a very, very plausible and straightforward hypothesis. It doesn't work. I tried it. That's not the case. In fact, there does not seem to be a really close correlation between what is being grown in a particular country versus what the artists are representing. You see that in all kinds of ways. The grape tradition is dominant in Northern Europe, in Germany at a certain point before the apple appears. Not very rich grape growing areas. It's dominant in Slavic art. These are artistic themes. They're not taken from the market of that day. So what is it? It is a linguistic change, but not the one that everyone thinks. In other words, people are saying, oh, it's from Latin. Interestingly, it's not from Latin, but it's from the vernacular. That is to say, it has to do with a change that happens in spoken vernacular Old French. The word that appears in Latin for fruit, there's one word which is fructus, and there's another word which is pomum. And pomum means like a tree fruit, basically, a general term for tree fruit. Now, something very interesting happens in Old French as it evolves from Latin. Basically, Old French is, descends from Latin. We already mentioned the problematic of the word malum, apple, namely that it sounds the same as the word for evil. And indeed, in Old French, there is no word that comes from malum, apple, no Latin word. The Latin word malum, in the sense of apple, does not find its way into Old French, probably because of the fact that it means evil. No one's saying, hey, pass me an evil, I'm hungry. Did you get 2 pounds of evil from the market?
Right.
It's like a bad omen. It's like evil eye, whatever it is, they don't use it.
Mm-hmm.
There is the word that comes from pomum, pom, which early on means fruit. In Old French, it just means fruit. It's a generic term. However, due to the absence of another word for apple, the word pomum over time begins to change its meaning. And rather than referring to fruit in general, the meaning begins to narrow, and it ultimately comes to mean apple, as it does in modern French. Now, why is that significant? Because in the early stages of Old French engagement with the story of Adam and Eve, by far the most dominant term used to describe the fruit was pomme. The earliest translation of the book of Genesis into Old French uses the word pomme. But not just Bible stories. There are ancient histories that start with Adam and Eve. There are poems that talk about the fall of man and the sin and the temptation. They predominantly use the word poem. All of these early sources refer to poem. Early French theater refers to poem. There's a play called the Jeu d'Adam, the Adam play. It uses the word poem to describe the forbidden fruit. At this stage, when these works, the Bible translation and the poems and the histories and the theater, early on, these were all meant to refer to a fruit. It was just the rendering of Latin pomum, meaning fruit, nothing unusual, nothing problematic. However, once this semantic change occurred in Old French and the word pomme no longer meant fruit, but rather came to mean apple, all of these earlier sources in Old French were, in a most straightforward way, simply and straightforwardly understood to mean apple. So if you read the Old French Genesis after this shift occurred, Eve gave Adam a pomme. She gave him an apple. If you see the play, if you hear a sermon in Old French, a vernacular sermon, and the priest refers to the poem, you understand it to mean an apple. That is the moment where you find that artists begin representing the forbidden fruit as an apple. So this shift, which actually occurs in a completely different world than that of biblical interpretation, it has nothing to do with the Bible. It has nothing to do with theology. It's just the spoken language of the French, that just they spoke Old French. This change occurred. This change ends up reflecting back on the book of Genesis and transforming the forbidden fruit into an apple.
I love this. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book as well is that people tend to assume when they just don't think about an argument, assume that culture comes from the top down, right?
Right.
It comes from the people who are writing down biblical commentary, and that's where it comes from. When really it could just have been your ordinary jobbing artists who hear the word pomme and are like, well, it's going to be an apple.
It's an apple. That's right. No, that's right. And I think that's actually, it's a significant point because I do think that scholarship tends to gravitate toward written culture, high culture, making all these assumptions about, it's a biblical symbol, so there must be some theological basis to it. Well, not necessarily, not necessarily. In this case, at least, I don't think that's the case. I think it is exactly as you say. It's coming from the spoken language of this artist. He hears that it's a poem. And I mean, also that answers the second question to some extent, which is, why did it marginalize all the other fruit? Well, if you think the book of Genesis in Old French, if you think the Bible says Eve gave Adam a poem that is an apple, well, that's it, right? I mean, why would you represent a fig? Why would you represent a pomegranate? Anything.
Right.
You're going to draw it as an apple because the discussion is basically closed at this point. And that's in fact what happened, and in fact, that's what happens. And so those are the first two questions, why does it happen there and then? And why does it dominate the way it does? It's because of the linguistic change. And that's actually also why it spreads the way it does. That's why the symbol is propagated the way it does. Both English, by which I mean Middle English and Middle High German, undergo the same semantic change. Apfel in German and Apfel in Middle English were originally generic terms for fruit, which I did not know when I started this project. That was, a wonderful thing as an English speaker to learn more about English.
Mm.
And they both, probably under the incredibly dominant influence of French, they undergo the similar semantic narrowing. They come to mean apple, and a similar process occurs. In other words, texts that had referred to the apple, meaning fruit, come to be read as apple in the way that we use the term. But that semantic change never happens in Italian. The Italian word for apple, mela, comes from, let's say the Latin malum, something, or it's related to that word, to that family. It never meant fruit generically. None of that happens. And in fact, the Italians keep representing the forbidden fruit as a fig. I mean, even if you look on the Sistine Chapel, it's clearly a fig, and that's early 16th century, right? So it stays a fig because the linguistic change did not occur in Italian the way it did, first in French and then in English and German.
It must have caused some confusion, I think, even back in the day, where you would have people traveling and saying, but it says right here it's an apple.
Yeah.
It says right here. Why are you making it a fig?
A fig, yeah.
Unless they traced it back the way you have linguistically. Like you say, it's self-reinforcing. You look back to this word that once meant fruit, but it says apple.
That's right. That's right. No, it is self-reinforcing. And look, very learned people working in the last decades and centuries have not recognized this. I would not expect, someone just traveling, let's say from France to Italy, they would be taken by the shift. They might be perplexed by it. They might think it's a bunch of heretical Italians. So what do you know? Who knows? It depends but it would be very hard to reconstruct this for someone working in the 13th or 14th century without access to the kind of resources we have today, both in terms of the art history, both in terms of the iconography, but also in terms of like the history of these languages and when precisely this change occurs. People tend to be not very reflective about their native tongue. We don't really think about the language we speak. We're born into it. We grow up in it. It's so basic to who we are and how we think that we tend not to reflect on it, unless we end up going into linguistics or something like that. But generally, people who understood pomme to mean apple would not have known that earlier strata of Old French understood it differently.
Mm-hmm. I'm just picturing people sitting down with a pint and arguing their case. I mean,
right.
I think you could still have people from France saying, well, figs and grapes, they are sexier and that's sinful. And I get that.
Right. Right.
But it says right here, it's an apple. So
what I would not give for the recording, if someone had written down this argument, maybe they're out there. I've never come across one, but there's so much material out there. Maybe at some point I'll find a source that's exactly what you're mentioning, of someone debating this and arguing their case for their national forbidden fruit, as it were.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, the national forbidden
Sure, Team
fruit.
Apple versus Team Fig.
Well, you're mentioning that obviously you couldn't exhaust the sources, and you do narrow your argument down to Western Europe and Southern into the Mediterranean, but not the entire tradition, because this is huge. But
Right.
One of the arguments in your book is it's kind of a rallying cry for working across disciplines. So what do you want to say about this work and how it can be valuable to work across disciplines?
Well, I mean, I think that if as scholars, we are going to reflect on obviously our successes, but also our failures, then we would have to say that this is not a great success. Let's put it that way. The fact that this idea that malum, the Latin word, is the cause of the forbidden fruit becoming an apple, I found this in 16th century texts. This idea has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And, it hasn't been properly scrutinized. People are still quoting it, still referencing it just as received wisdom. It's not like you have a footnote that shows where this happens or cites the sources. It's just like, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons that this error has sustained itself in this way is that the alternative that I'm proposing is not available through any single discipline. In other words, if you only look, let's say, at the Latin sources, you will end up confused because you'll say there's no real tradition that says malum, evil, malum, apple. That's why the fruit is an apple. But you'll have no recourse to anything else. There's just no answer. Once you bring in the art history, you say, okay, well, at least now I see where it appears. The artistic material tells us that this happens in 12th century France, and I can map out how it spreads. And by the way, let me just say in parentheses that I have a website of these artistic works, and it's completely free and open to anyone who wants to visit it. It's called treeofknowledgeart.com, and everyone's invited to it. It's searchable. You can look by region, by period, whatever you want. Once you put that together, then you at least have a more definitive historical context of when the apple. But even then, you don't know why. It's only when you bring in the vernacular semantics, the vernacular language changes, that you can put the whole thing together. So I think that the kind of historic inability of scholars to reach the conclusion that the malum hypothesis isn't really adequate and what might be a better interpretation, the failure to do that has a lot to do with people working within one discipline and not either themselves reaching out into other disciplines or collaborating with people in other disciplines. And that it's only if we work across these boundaries, again, either as individual scholars who want to reach across these boundaries or in groups of scholars and, working groups and things like that, that a lot of questions are going to be adequately addressed.
I think that is so true, especially if you have things that develop out of the connectedness of humanity. Yeah. The only way to find the answer is to connect back in, don't you think?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Pretty much everything is like that. I mean, if you're studying one author and you want to see, the manuscript of this particular book, great. It's a very, very specific question, and you can just roll up your sleeves and work on it. But if you're looking at broader symbols that find their way into art and literature and theology and interpretation and what have you, then of course there's a much higher probability of a successful investigation if you can broaden your own scholarly horizons.
I think that's so important. And as you mentioned before we started recording, you don't tend to play in the Middle Ages. So I think we're already taking steps here to
That's right. I'm already I'm already in new territory, for better or for worse. Yes.
Yes. And before we go, I do want to put in a plug for your new project, which is bringing together the connectedness of languages again, which I think is so important, especially when you're studying things like ancient periods, the medieval period, where you have this trade and intermingling of language is as important as today, for sure. So what are you working on that is bringing languages together for people?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I have a side project that basically involves writing kind of like dictionaries or lexicons of different foreign languages and the English words that come from the same root or that are related to them historically. The series is called Intuitive Vocabulary, and I've already published 3 volumes in it: Intuitive Vocabulary German, Intuitive Vocabulary Spanish, and just recently, Intuitive Vocabulary Ancient Greek. And the idea here is that there's such a rich historical connection, like historical linguistic connection, between Indo-European languages that belong to the same very broad language family that encompasses Greek and English and the Romance languages and Latin, that there is a benefit to employing those connections to make it easier to learn that language. So basically, the books provide, let's say, if I'm looking at the Spanish book, it's a list of Spanish words that have a certain kind of relationship with English words that come from the same root. And the idea is that it's then much easier, much more simple to learn the vocabulary of the foreign language, because you're not memorizing. It's not rote memorization. Rather, you see the word and you're like, I see the connection to a word I already know as an English speaker, and that facilitates the learning. And this is really just done for the love of languages, to get people to learn and to appreciate kind of the interconnectedness of our languages, and hopefully to feel more at home with these foreign languages.
I think that, first of all, it's lovely that you're working on at least 3 languages together and saying it's a side project. But everybody, listen to Azzan's words on this, because you speak, around a dozen languages. This actually works, bringing back these connections.
It really works. It's so effective. I hope other people find that to be the case.
Yes. Well, I wanted to bring that to the forefront because languages are so important when you're studying the Middle Ages, which is what we do here. So Thank you so much for telling us about that project and for telling us how the apple came to be the forbidden fruit. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you, Danièle. Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here.
To learn more about Azzan's work, you can visit his academia.edu page at rutgers.academia.edu/Azzan Yadin-Israel. His latest books are the Intuitive Vocabulary series, with the Ancient Greek volume hot off the press about 2 weeks ago, and Temptation Transformed, the story of how the forbidden fruit became an apple. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have a piece on 517 Viking nicknames.
Nice.
It was a dissertation done several years ago, and someone compiled a list of all the Viking names found in Old Norse sources. And as you can imagine, it's great. It covers everything from everyday pieces of the body to really kind of explicit stuff.
I was going to ask, if you made a pie chart, how many of these would be insults?
Yeah, I think half of them are good and half of them are not good. My favorite one, I don't know if it's a good or a bad one, but my favorite is Asmund throwing ass.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a really good one.
Yeah. I kind of would like that nickname. So.
Don't expect me to call you that over coffee.
Okay. I doubt that you will. So you can explore that. Plus, we have Tibur Khan as his second article on Babur, looking at his campaigns against Afghans. Some early 16th century stuff for you. And we also have a second piece from Padina Assad on 12th century maps of the Holy Land and what they meant to express. All those lovely little, ones of Jerusalem, like big nice circle.
I love medieval maps.
Lots of stuff to explore in them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got all that and more.
Nice. Looks like a nice spread of articles.
Now, we have a couple of interesting weeks ahead of us, right?
Yes, it's going to be a busy couple of weeks. So just for everyone to know, the episodes are going to be kind of spotty for a little while. And that is because Peter and I are both doing adventurous stuff. So very soon I'm going to be headed to the Chalk Valley History Festival, which is just outside of Salisbury in the UK. And we'll be speaking there about a bunch of things. So I'm really excited about this. I'm going to be talking to school kids about how to survive the zombie apocalypse based on my book about that. And then talking to the grown-ups about how to live like a monk based on that book. And then I'll be speaking again later on in the week, but I'm going to be there all week at Chalk Valley. I'm going to be talking to all my favorite blacksmith peeps and seeing what they're doing, the experimental archaeologists. So, tune into my social media because I'm going to be posting as much as I can there.
Yeah, that's an incredible history festival, right?
Yeah, it's really so good. And the people there are just experts. And I love the vibe. So I'm really happy to be there. So that's going to be keeping me busy. And then both you and I are headed to Leeds to the International Medieval Congress. And we're going to be doing the Medieval Podcast live there.
I know. This is the very first time we are doing a live episode of your podcast.
Yeah, so we're recording it live and unedited. Usually the podcasts are edited, but this is going to be a live recording, and then we're going to post it hopefully at the regular time. But it's going to be with everyone's favorite Eleanor Yanniga. So that's going to be just such a great time, I think.
Yes. So if you will be one of the people attending the International Medieval Congress, we would love you to come and be part of the audience. And Medievalist.net's doing a whole bunch of stuff at the Congress. So I think we're like the entertainment.
Yeah. So we're doing a live podcast, the Medieval podcast. Then Michael and Kelly are doing a live Bow and Blade, I think, the next day. You and I are also doing a workshop for people there to help them become podcasters. So that's pretty busy. And then the week after that, we're both going to be traveling in England. And then I'm actually going to take a week off, Peter. Isn't that weird?
Oh my. I didn't know I could allow such a thing. It never happened.
I got news for you. It's not up to you. I'm going to take a week off.
That's true.
I mean, usually I've missed a couple of episodes over the course of a year every once in a while, but I've had a pretty good rapid pace this year. So I'm going to be taking a couple of weeks off. So the episodes are going to be a bit sporadic, but that's we are working hard. I am, and then you are as well, to collect really good medieval stuff to be sharing over the next few months.
Yeah. I love going out to England in early July for this Congress and, explore a few sites and stuff like that. It boosts me internally, right? Like I get all my medieval fix in because, it's not too much medieval in Toronto, Canada. So
there's us. There's a good community here, but there aren't the same amount of medieval buildings here in Canada, right? So we get to walk around and stomp on those grounds, which will be really nice.
Exciting times. People, please tune in on the social media and you'll see probably lots and lots of photos and images and hopefully a lot of fun things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by. And everyone can just tune into our social media to keep up with us. And yeah, it's going to be an exciting summer.
Yay.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you this week and every week to everyone who supports this podcast, as well as other indie podcasters and historians through Medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons can access all sorts of amazing stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of this podcast and Extra Medieval. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from fruit to Canute, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, on social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. You can even pre-order my new book, Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, which comes out in September. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.